People ask me how it felt. Standing on the bridge of the solemn oath, 11 years of diplomatic preparation behind us, the Thessivane cradle burning pink and gold outside the viewports. They want to know whether I was afraid, whether the weight of it, speaking for Earth, speaking for every human colony and way station and drifting habitat we'd put out among the stars, sat, heavy enough to crack a man. I tell them I was not afraid. I was attentive. There's a distinction worth making. And I've spent the better part of 30 years trying to explain it to people who weren't there. Fear is a response to uncertainty. What I had on that bridge was the opposite of uncertainty. I had a very clear picture of what the day was supposed to look like, what the Vethrani Concord expected of us, what my crew had trained for, and what the solemn oath was going to do when the moment came. Clarity was almost physical. I could feel the shape of the next 4 hours the same way you can feel the weight of a tool in your hand before you lifted it. What I could not feel, what none of us could, was the shape of the Vethrani's certainty, and that, in the end, is what the day was really about. I should say something about the ship first. People who weren't alive in that era, who were children when the footage finally declassified, tend to picture the solemn oath as some sleek diplomatic vessel, frigate with a nice paint job, a courier dressed up for a ceremony. That image is wrong, and it matters that it's wrong, because the misunderstanding gets at the heart of what happened in the Thessivane cradle on the 14th day of November in 2187. The solemn oath was a Cathedral-class strategic warship. The Cathedral designation, for those unfamiliar with the hull taxonomy of that period, referred to the cruciform profile, a primary spine of roughly 4 kilometers in length, 2 secondary superstructures, extending laterally from the midsection, giving the ship its characteristic cross-shaped silhouette when viewed from the front or rear. The lateral extensions house the secondary weapons arrays, the full-zote sensor wings, the additional drive nacelles for high-gravity maneuver, and, most critically, the outer hull plating that gave the Cathedral its real scale. When the lateral wings were folded, which was their standard transit configuration, the solemn oath's visible profile was perhaps a third of her true breadth. She read, on most sensor arrays, as a large but not exceptional vessel. A warship, certainly, a significant one, but not what she was. I want to be precise here, because the imprecision of most accounts has created exactly the wrong impression of what we intended. We did not fold the wings to deceive the Vethrani. We did not fold the wings as a tactical strategy. We folded the wings because they were always folded in transit, because unfolding them in the middle of a diplomatic approach without cause have been read as a threat display, and because no one, not me, not my XO, not the diplomatic attaché assigned to the mission, not the admirals at Terran Fleet Command who approved the mission parameters, gave a second's thought to what the Vethrani might have concluded from 11 years of observation. We assumed they knew the wings folded. We assumed they understood what a Cathedral-class ship was. That assumption was, I now understand, the most human thing we brought to the Thessivane cradle. Not the ship, not the weapons. Our assumption that we had been seen. I need to tell you about the Vethrani Concord before I can tell you what happened when we arrived, because you cannot understand the significance of the choir falling silent unless you understand what the choir was, and what silence meant to it. The Vethrani are. I will use the present tense, because the Concord still exists, considerably changed but present, a species that evolved on a world of near-constant low-frequency resonance. Their home system sits within the active inner edge of the Thessivane Nebula, which generates a permanent electromagnetic hum detectable at planetary distances. Over 1 billion years of evolutionary pressure, the Vethrani developed sensory organs of extraordinary complexity in response to that hum. Their primary sensory mode is not vision, though they have visual organs of limited range. It is acoustic, not in the way we mean when we say a person is musical, in the way we mean when we say a structure is load-bearing. Their nervous system is fundamentally organized around the processing of resonant frequency. They hear, in ranges and with discrimination that makes our best instruments look crude, everything around them. This biology, they built a civilization, and from that civilization they built a theology. From that theology, they built a governing structure that had held together a cluster of 22 inhabited systems for 600 years before humanity left Earth's solar system for the first time. The theology, and I say this with the precise respect it deserves, meaning neither contempt nor uncritical reverence, is called the resonance doctrine. Its core assertion is that all living things emit a fundamental resonant frequency that is the expression of their spiritual significance, place in what the Vethrani texts call the sounding of all things. Species with complex, layered frequencies are held to be of higher spiritual rank. Species with simple or discordant signatures are lower. The Vethrani themselves emit a frequency of extraordinary complexity. They had the measurements. They had been measuring 4 centuries. And, by their own doctrine, they sat comfortably near the upper register of all things they had ever encountered. When the Concord made contact with a new species, they sent the classification choir. Choir was not a religious delegation in the sentimental sense. It was the Concord's primary instrument of galactic governance. 27 senior resonance readers, each trained for decades in the discrimination of interspecies frequency, accompanied by a high observer whose role was to receive the choir's assessment and issue the classification. The formal assignment of spiritual rank to the new species. The classification determined everything about the Concord's subsequent relationship with that species. Whether they were admitted as full members of the Concord sphere, whether they were treated as spiritual subordinates, whether they were left alone as beings too simple to govern, or, in the rarest and most consequential category, whether they were assessed as spiritually dangerous and dealt with accordingly. In 600 years of classification, no species had ever been placed above the Vethrani themselves. This was not, as far as the Concord's theologians were concerned, arrogance. It was simply the measurement, the data. The choir had sung in the presence of every species in the cluster, and the numbers had always come back the same. The Vethrani were at the top of the sounding. This was not a belief they held against evidence. It was a belief they held with evidence, because the evidence had never failed them. We had been in the Concord's observation range for 11 years. Before the classification was formally quested, I want you to understand how careful the Concord was. They did not rush into classification. 11 years of observation, 11 years of passive listening, long-range sensor arrays, resonance capture equipment of astonishing sensitivity, monitoring stations, concealed in the debris clouds at the edges of transit corridors. They had listened to human ships, crossing through the outer edges of their sphere. They had measured us. They had run the frequencies through their instruments many times, cross-referenced the results against 600 years of comparative data, and arrived at a classification estimate before they ever requested the formal ceremony. We knew about the observations. We had detected their monitoring stations 3 years in. Terran Fleet Command made the decision not to interfere, not to expose the surveillance, not to react. The diplomatic service believed, correctly, as it turned out, that the Concord was building toward a formal contact request, and that any disruption of their observation process might poison the relationship before it began. So we let them watch. We modified our transit patterns slightly to give their stations better angles. We flew the routes they seemed most interested in. We cooperated with the observation without telling them we were cooperating, and we waited. In 2186, the Concord transmitted a request for classification. They wanted one human vessel to enter the Thessivane cradle at a precise time, and on a precise heading, alone, to receive the choir. They specified that the vessel should be representative, that the humans should send something that, expressed in their own estimation, the truest picture of what they were. We sent the solemn oath, the diplomatic attaché assigned to the mission, a woman named Counselor Yoon-ji Pak, who had spent 14 years studying everything we knew about the Vethrani Concord, told me, in the weeks before departure, that the Vethrani would almost certainly begin the classification at our border with their sacred space and refine it as we approached. She said that the choir would be listening to us from the moment we entered the cradle, that our ship systems, our drive emissions, communications frequencies, our structural resonance, as the hull responded to the nebula's electromagnetic field, all of it would be part of the measurement. She said we should run everything as we normally would, neither suppressing our emissions nor exaggerating them. She said we should simply be what we were. I told her, "That is what we do." She smiled at that. She was a small woman, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent most of her professional life in rooms where the wrong word could start a war. She said, "I know. That's why I asked for this ship." We departed Terran space on the 2nd of November and arrived at the Thessivane Cradle on the 13th, running at transit configuration, wings folded, drives at standard cruise output, all active systems operating normally. I had a crew of 412. Good people. The best I'd ever commanded, and I say that without the softening of nostalgia. The solemn oath had been in service for 9 years at that point, and her crew had been with her for most of that. They knew the ship the way you know a tool that has never let you down. Quiet, professional, attentive. We crossed the boundary of the cradle at 06:13 hours ship's time on the 14th of November, and I watched the nebula take us. I have seen many remarkable things in my career. The Thessivane Cradle is, without question, the most beautiful. It is a stellar nursery, approximately 40 light-years across, burning with the light of young stars at various stages of formation, some barely, past the protostellar cloud still wrapped in their cocoons of dust and gas, others already blazing, their stellar winds driving vast currents of ionized gas into luminous curtains that hang across the cradle like drapery in a cathedral. The color shifts as you move through it. At our entry point, it was rose and amber. By the time we reached the choir's designated meeting coordinate, it had deepened to a royal blue at the periphery, with a hot white core from the nearest young star, Thessivane proper, burning perhaps 6 light minutes off our port quarter. My bridge crew ran their stations without comment. The viewports were set to display rather than raw sensor feed, and I noticed several of the officers glancing up at the nebula as we crossed into deeper cradle space. I didn't reprimand them for it. A man who can't pause for a moment in the presence of genuine beauty is not a man I particularly want in command of a weapons array. We reached the designated coordinate at 1104 hours. The Vethrani choir was already there. I had expected that. What I had not expected, though in retrospect I should have, was their number. The Concord's formal documentation of classification procedures had mentioned 27 choir members and a high observer. What the documentation had not mentioned, or what our translators had failed to capture, was that each choir member traveled on a separate vessel, and that the high observer's ship was of a class we had not previously catalogued. I had anticipated perhaps 3 or 4 vessels. What my sensors showed was 31. They were beautiful ships in their way. Long, tapered at both ends, built in flowing organic curves rather than the hard geometry of military construction. They were roughly 300 meters in length each, which made them considerably smaller than the solemn oath even at her folded profile. But there were 31 of them arranged in a precise formation, a 3-dimensional pattern that I recognized from Counselor Pack's briefings. As the configuration of assembly, the formal posture of the classification choir, in the presence of a subject species, the high observer's ship was at the center. It was perhaps twice the length of the others and significantly broader, built in a flattened ellipsoid with elaborate resonance broadcasting structures extending from its forward aspect. Long spines covered in what appeared to be a crystalline material that caught the nebula light and scattered it in complex patterns. It was, I understood, not a weapon. It was an instrument. The high observer's ship was in effect a tuning fork of galactic scale. Counselor Pack came to the bridge at 11:06 and stood beside my chair. She looked at the choir formation on the sensor display for a long moment. "They're already measuring us," she said. "Since we crossed the cradle boundary, I'd expect." "Yes, but they're doing something specific now. See the orientation of the outer choir ships? They've rotated 10 degrees from standard configuration of assembly. That's a focused listening posture. They've been in assembly since before we arrived. They already have a preliminary estimate, and they're refining it." "What does that tell us?" She was quiet for a moment. "It tells us they're confident." The high observer's ship opened communications at 11:09. The transmission came through on the designated frequency. We had exchanged protocol documentation over the preceding months, through the Concord's diplomatic relay at the cradle boundary. and my comms officer, Lieutenant Commander Hana Yoshida, routed it through the translation buffer and put it on my earpiece. The Vethrani language, when transmitted in formal register, has a quality that I will attempt to describe only once because language fails it. It sounds like music that has decided to carry information. Fundamental tones are sustained and harmonically complex, and the meaning-bearing elements are variations in overtone and rhythm rather than distinct phonemes in the way human language works. Our translation software had been working from academic models for 6 years before the formal contact request. By the time of the choir meeting, it could handle formal register at roughly 80% fidelity, which Counselor Pack considered adequate for protocol exchange, but warned me would miss significant nuance. The High Observer, whose formal title translates approximately as the one who holds the final frequency, the Counselor Pack preferred the shorter rendering. The Keeper spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. The translation reached me in structured fragments as the software caught up, and I will give you the substance of it, rather than pretend I remember each phrase. The Keeper welcomed us to the Thessivane cradle. The Keeper acknowledged that our entry into Concord observed space represented a significant moment in the sounding of all things, and that the Concord had undertaken its observation of humanity with the seriousness appropriate to any species that had demonstrated the capacity, interstellar travel, and organized governance. The Keeper stated that the classification choir had completed 11 years of observation and was prepared to deliver the result of that observation in the form of the formal assessment, the first stage of the classification ceremony. The formal assessment would be spoken aloud in our presence, as was the Concord's practice. The subject species was always told what had been determined about them. Transparency was, the Keeper said, the most sacred quality of the resonance doctrine. The sounding of all things was not a secret to be kept. It was a truth to be declared. I listened to this. I kept my face neutral. Counselor Pack, beside me, had her eyes on the deck. I leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "They're going to tell us our rank." "Yes," she said, "before we've said a word. They've been measuring us for 11 years. As far as they're concerned, they already know." I considered that for a moment. Then I said, "Let them speak." The Keeper's ship oriented its resonance structures toward us. I could see the crystalline spines adjust on the visual feed, rotating to face the solemn oath, and the formal assessment began. I will not reproduce the assessment in full. It lasted 23 minutes and covered, in the Vethrani's precise and formal language, every dimension of humanity that the choir had measured during 11 years of observation. Our drive emissions and what they indicated about our technological development, the resonant signature of our hull materials, and what that revealed about our metallurgical sophistication, the electromagnetic patterns of our communications and what they suggested about our cognitive organization, the behavioral patterns the Concord had observed in our transit routes, the regularity, the apparent caution at certain junction points, the clustering of ships in what the choir had determined were defensive convoy formations. They had measured all of it. They had measured it carefully and seriously and without contempt. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The Vethrani Concord was not dismissive of humanity. They had given us more sustained and rigorous attention than any species had ever given us before contact. The assessment was a thorough and in many ways accurate picture of what humanity looked like from the outside, based in the 12th tier of the resonance hierarchy. Out of 17 tiers, the 12th tier was designated, in the Concord's classification language, as the emerging harmonics tier. Species that showed meaningful cognitive and technological development, but whose resonance signature lacked the depth and complexity associated with spiritual seniority. Capable, interesting, not yet realized. The Concord's proposed relationship for 12th tier species was a form of supervised integration. Humanity would be welcomed into the outer structures of Concord governance, but would not hold decision-making authority. Our views would be heard and considered. Our policies would be subject to Concord review for their resonant implications. We would, in the language of their documentation, be accompanied through our development rather than left to find our own path. Counselor Pack had briefed me on all of this before the mission. She had told me that the Concord's pre-contact communications strongly suggested a classification in the lower middle range. She had told me to receive the assessment without reaction, because any response to the classification, before it was formally complete, would be read by the choir as a disruption of the ceremony, which was considered a grave discourtesy. She had told me that our response to the classification would be the critical moment, that what we said, and did after the keeper finished speaking, would define the Concord's relationship with humanity for the foreseeable future. I had listened to all of her preparation. I had agreed with most of it. I had also, quietly, made one decision of my own, which I had communicated to my crew 3 days before we entered the cradle, and which I had not, with great care and deliberate intention, mentioned to Counselor Pack. The keeper concluded the formal assessment at 11:37. There was a pause, 12 seconds, which I counted, and then the keeper spoke again, a single short phrase. Counselor Pack's translation came through clearly. The classification is determined. The species designated humanity stands in the 12th tier of the sounding of all things, among the emerging harmonics. This determination is offered in transparency and received in transparency, as the doctrine requires. 12 seconds of silence from the choir formation. I press the intercom key at my armrest. Engineering. This is the admiral. Execute wing extension on my mark. My chief engineer's voice came back flat and steady. Engineering ready, Admiral. I looked at the sensor display. I looked at the 31 Vethrani ships, in their configuration of assembly, their resonance spines oriented toward us, instruments still running, their choir still listening. I said, Mark. The solemn oath unfolded. I have tried, over the years, to describe this adequately, and I don't think I have ever quite managed it. Let me try once more. The wing extension sequence on a Cathedral-class ship takes approximately 90 seconds from initiation to full lock. The lateral superstructures, each one roughly 1.5 kilometers in length and 400 meters in height at their broadest point, rotate outward from the stored position along the primary spine, pivoting on hydraulic gimbals the size of small houses, moving with a slowness that looks almost ceremonial when you watch it from outside. The outer hull panels that were folded against the spine during transit unfold as the wing extends, revealing the secondary weapons arrays, the sensor wing structures, the additional drive nacelles. At full extension, the solemn Othos beam, her width, measured from the tip of one lateral superstructure to the other, was 4.3 kilometers. In transit configuration, she read as roughly 800 meters across. The difference is not subtle. I watched the sensor display as the choir formation registered the change. The 31 ships had been static sync in their assembly configuration, perfectly still, which was itself a form of communication in Vethrani ceremonial practice, a demonstration of deliberate attention. They did not move for the first 30 seconds after wing extension began. I imagine the choir's instruments were experiencing something they had no prior data category for, the object they had been measuring. The object they had classified and ranked and assigned to the 12th tier of the sounding of all things was becoming something different. Not a different ship. The same ship. The ship they had measured. Becoming, in front of their instruments, 4 times wider than it had been a minute ago. At 43 seconds into the extension sequence, the outermost choir ships, the ones at the periphery of the assembly configuration, began to move. Not toward us, not away. A lateral shift, a small adjustment of their orientation that my tactical officer identified as a repositioning for better sensor angle. They were trying to get a complete picture of what was happening. At 61 seconds, the high observer's ship, the keeper's vessel, the great tuning fork at the center of the formation, rotated its resonance spines, not to broadcast. The spines closed inward, folding against the ship's hull in a configuration I had not seen in any of our documentation on Vethrani vessels. Counselor Pack saw it at the same moment I did, she said. That's a receiving posture. They're not transmitting anymore. They're listening. Passive receive. What does that mean for the ceremony? She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then I don't know. I don't think the ceremony has a provision for this. The wing extension completed at 11:39. The solemn oath locked into full configuration. 4,300 meters beam. The secondary drives came online in passive mode, not firing, but their energy signatures present, readable. The additional power plant of the wing nacelles, contributing their electromagnetic output to the ship's overall profile. Wire formation held still. I had expected, or perhaps hoped is the more honest word, some kind of immediate reaction. Motion, communication, something that would tell me we had been understood. What I got was silence. 31 Vethrani ships, motionless, in the blue-white light of the Thessivane cradle, their instruments running and their transmissions stopped. It lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Counselor Pack stood beside me throughout. She did not speak. She had her arms crossed. It was unusual for her. She was not a woman who held her own body as a comfort generally. I noticed it and said nothing. The bridge crew ran their stations. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida kept the comms open on all designated frequencies and reported every 60 seconds that there was no transmission from the choir. My tactical officer tracked the choir's position and reported no movement. Chief engineer confirmed full extension and structural integrity throughout. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of Vethrani silence, in the middle of the classification ceremony of an alien species, is, I later learned from the Concord's own historical records, an event without precedent. The records of every classification conducted in 600 years show an unbroken ceremonial sequence from the formal assessment to the acknowledgement, the subject species' formal response, to the binding, in which the high observer declares the classification permanent and all parties transmit their agreement. The longest pause between assessment and acknowledgement in the recorded history of the Concorde was 41 seconds, when a species called the Oranthic, classified in the 8th tier, a respectable position, apparently needed time to process the translation. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I found out later what was happening inside the keeper's ship during those 4 minutes. It took years of careful diplomatic exchange to get the full picture, and even then, some of it came through second-hand accounts from Vethrani, scholars who were willing to discuss it only in private. I'll tell you what I know. The choir had, over 11 years, built what they called a resonant portrait of humanity. A composite measurement across hundreds of ship passages, accumulated observations, the aggregate of everything they had detected from the ships we had allowed to pass through their observation range. That portrait was the foundation of the 12th tier classification. It was, by their own standards, thorough work. They were proud of it. The choir's instruments were calibrated to a precision that could distinguish two members of the same species at 100 meters. 11 years of data. They were certain. What their instruments were now reporting, as the solemn oath extended her full profile, as the additional drive nacelles spun up, as the sensor wings unfolded and began their own emissions, as the secondary weapons arrays came into passive configuration and their power signatures became readable, was a resonant portrait roughly 4 times more complex than the one the choir had assembled. Not a different ship, the same ship. The one they had measured at the cradle boundary. The one they had tracked for 93 minutes on approach. The one whose frequency they had cross-referenced against 11 years of accumulated data and confirmed, with confidence, as the specific vessel humanity had sent for classification. It was the same ship. It was 4 times what they had measured. The choir's instruments, as I later understood it, did not fail. They were working perfectly. Problem was not instrumentation. The problem was that the choir had spent 11 years measuring human ships in transit configuration, and had never had cause to consider that transit configuration might be a fraction of what the ships actually were. Why would they? No species in 600 years of Concord observation had operated in a sustained partial configuration as its normal transit mode. Why would a species routinely operate at a third of its actual profile? It wasn't concealment, it was engineering. Cathedral-class ships folded their wings because the wings were vulnerable at transit speeds, because the folded configuration reduced radiation drag in certain nebular environments, because it was simply how the ships were designed to travel. It was as ordinary to us as folding a landing gear. We had not thought to explain it because it had not occurred to us that it needed explaining. We had built a class of warship that was, in transit, a third of what it was in full extension. And we had flown that class of warship through the Vethrani observation range for 11 years. And the Vethrani had measured what they saw, and what they saw was a third of what we sent. The choir had classified a mask. They had spent 11 years, with their finest instruments and their most sophisticated methodology, carefully and rigorously measuring the outside of a folded ship and concluding they understood everything inside it. When the keeper finally transmitted again, at 11:43 hours, the message was 6 words in formal Vethrani register. Counselor Pack's translation came through in 3, "We have erred." Not, "We require additional measurement." Not, "The classification is under review." Not, "Explain this configuration change." 3 words. A direct acknowledgement from the Instrument Concord spiritual authority that their measurement had produced an incorrect result. I have thought about those 6 Vethrani words, 3 in translation, for 30 years, and I think they may be the most significant thing anyone said that day. We have erred. I pressed the comms key. I had a prepared response. Counselor Pack and I had written 4 possible responses to 4 possible Vethrani reactions, and we had rehearsed them carefully. I did not use any of them. I said, "We understand." 2 words. Counselor Pack turned to look at me. I did not look at her. I watched the keeper's ship. The choir formation held still for another 40 seconds. Then, beginning with the outermost ships and moving inward toward the keeper's vessel, the Vethrani ships began to change their orientation. Slowly, each one rotating on its long axis, the resonance spines retracting, the assembly configuration dissolving into something else. Not a combat posture, not a flight posture. Something I hadn't seen documented. It took me a moment to identify it. They were turning to face their keeper. All 31 ships, rotating to place the keeper's vessel at the center of their attention. The outer choir members facing inward. It was a conferral posture. They were, in the middle of the classification ceremony, doing something the ceremony apparently did not have a provision for. Stopping to talk among themselves. I said to Counselor Pack quietly, "How long can we afford to wait?" She said, "As long as they need." I nodded. Then we wait. We waited for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I will not pretend those 2 hours were without tension. They were some of the longest of my career. The bridge crew maintained their stations. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida monitored the frequencies. My tactical officers tracked the choir's positions, which did not change. Counselor Pack sat in the secondary chair beside mine and was mostly still, occasionally making notes on her pad. I drank 2 cups of coffee that I do not recall tasting. The Thessivane cradle burned blue and white outside the viewports. At 13:54 hours, the keeper's ship transmitted again. The transmission lasted 37 minutes. Counselor Pack listened, with her eyes closed. The translation software ran its fragments through to my earpiece, and I followed as best I could. The formal register was dense with theological and procedural language that the software handled imperfectly, and I found myself watching Counselor Pack's face more than listening to the fragments. She was a good reader of this kind of thing, and her face would tell me faster than translation-y slayin' whether we were in trouble. Her face, of 37 minutes, moved through several things. Concentration. A slight narrowing of the eyes at several points that I read as surprise. Near the end, something that might have been relief, or might have been the particular stillness that comes after you, have been afraid. And the fear has resolved into something manageable. When the transmission ended, she opened her eyes and looked at me. "Well," she said, "tell me, Keeper is withdrawing the classification." I had expected several possible outcomes from this meeting. That was not among the ones I had prepared for. Withdrawing, not amending. Withdrawing in full. The Concord's records will show the classification as incomplete, which is, apparently, a category that has never existed before. The Keeper is stating that the choir's 11-year observation was conducted on insufficient data, and that the classification cannot be held as valid because the resonant portrait was not complete. They are not. And this is specific. They are not calling the measurement wrong. They are saying the subject of the measurement was not fully visible. I sat with that for a moment. They're not calling it our fault. No. And I don't think that's diplomatic softening. I think they genuinely mean it. She looked back down at her notes. The Keeper is also, and this is the part I want to be careful about, making a specific theological statement. I want to get the wording right because it matters. She consulted her pad for a moment. The keeper is stating that the resonance doctrine has, in 600 years of operation, operated on an assumption that a complete observation was achievable, given sufficient time and appropriate instruments. The events of today have, in the keeper's words, introduced a new category of measurement uncertainty, the possibility that a species' true resonant portrait is larger than its visible expression. The keeper is saying that this possibility was always theoretically present in the doctrine but had never, prior to today, been encountered in practice. She paused. The keeper is calling it the hidden harmony problem, and the keeper is saying that the Concord will need to convene its full theological council to determine what the doctrine requires in response. I looked at the choir formation. The 31 ships still in their conferral posture. The keeper's vessel at the center, its resonant spines folded. And in the meantime? In the meantime, the keeper is withdrawing all vessels from the cradle, except for a single relay ship at the boundary. The classification ceremony is concluded without result. The Cong invites humanity to resume contact through standard diplomatic channels once the Theological Council has reached a determination. How long will that take? She gave me a look that said she had no idea and knew better than to guess. Then we thank them and withdraw. I pressed the comms key and spoke the formal closing of the diplomatic exchange. A phrase we had prepared, a statement of mutual respect and willingness to continue, and watched the choir formation begin its withdrawal. One by one, beginning again with the outermost ships, they oriented away from us. The keeper's vessel was last. It held its position for perhaps 3 minutes after the others had begun moving, its hull facing us, its resonant spines folded inward in that passive receiving posture, listening, I supposed, one last time. Then it too oriented outbound and the drives lit, a soft gold in the blue of the cradle, and the classification choir withdrew from the Thessivane Nebula. The relay ship remained at the boundary, as promised, one small Vethrani vessel, alone at the edge of their sacred space, a presence that said, "The conversation is not closed." When the last choir ship had gone, my bridge was very quiet. The solemn oath held position in the blue-white light, her wings extended, her drives at idle. 4,300 meters of warship in a nebula that was otherwise empty of everything, except light, young stars and the quiet relay ship at the boundary. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida said, "No further transmissions, Admiral." "Thank you, Hana." Counselor Pack stood from the secondary chair and straightened her jacket. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the space where the choir had been. Then she said, "When were you going to tell me about the wing extension?" "About 30 seconds before I ordered it." She was silent. I waited. "That was a significant unilateral decision," she said. "It was. You didn't consult me." "No." Another silence then. "Why?" I thought about that for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, because I wanted to give her the honest one rather than the easy one. "Because," I said, "I didn't want the decision to be consultative. I wanted it to be mine. If it went wrong, the failure was mine. If it went right, the reasoning behind it needed to be simple enough that no one could argue it into something complicated afterward." She looked at me. "And the reasoning. They told us who we were before we'd spoken a word. They'd built a portrait of us from what they could see and decided the portrait was complete." I looked out at the cradle. I wanted them to know the portrait wasn't complete, not as an argument, not as a diplomatic point, just as a fact. Here is what you were measuring. Here is what you didn't see, not a threat, not a demonstration of power, just here we are, all of us. Counselor Pack was quiet for a long time. The keeper said, "We have erred." She said, Not, this is unexpected, or please explain your configuration. We have erred." Yes. That is a remarkable thing for the head of the Vethrani classification apparatus to say in the middle of a classification ceremony. "It is. It suggests to me," she said carefully, "that they are not only a thorough people, they are an honest one." That was my reading too. She nodded slowly. Then she said almost to herself, "Hidden harmony. They gave it a name." We began our withdrawal from the Thessivane cradle at 1412 hours. I ordered the wings held at full extension for the transit out. There was no tactical reason for it. We were not going through any environment that required the folded configuration. And I thought it was the honest posture. We flew out of the cradle at full profile, 4,300 meters of Cathedral-class warship, moving through the pink and amber light of the nebula's outer reaches, and I watched the light change on the hull through the viewport until the boundary was behind us, and we were back in the dark. I did not tell my crew anything they didn't already know. They had been there. They had run their stations through all of it, and they understood what had happened as well as I did, perhaps better in their individual specialties. What I told them on the ship-wide address at 1430 was this: you did your jobs. You did them the way you always do them. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was. Get some rest. It took 11 months for the Vethrani Concord's theological council to reach a determination. The determination, which Counselor Pack spent the better part of a year in careful back-channel communication preparing for, building on the relay channel through the boundary station with a patience and skill that I believe is the most significant unsung diplomatic work in human history, held that the hidden harmony problem required a fundamental revision to the classification procedure. Species could no longer be classified on observation alone. The classification ceremony would henceforth require a disclosure phase, in which the subject species was invited to present the fullest possible picture of itself before any assessment was made. Humanity was the first species to go through the revised procedure in 2189. We sent the solemn oath again, wings extended from the moment we crossed cradle boundary. The revised classification placed us in the 4th tier. I am sometimes asked whether that result, the 4th tier, the jump from 12th to 4th, was what I had intended when I ordered the wing extension. Whether the whole thing was a calculated play, whether I knew what the choir would do and moved accordingly. Give the same answer every time. I didn't know what the choir would do. I knew what the solemn otho could do. I knew what we were. I knew that the portrait they had built of us, thorough as it was a picture of a ship that hadn't opened its eyes yet. That seemed like information they should have. The whole of it. Not a negotiating position. Not a demonstration of dominance. A move in a sequence. Just the truth of what was standing in front of them offered plainly in the blue-white light of their sacred space. What they did with it was up to them. They called it the hidden harmony. I've always found that a generous name for what it was. A ship that forgot to unfold, as observed by instruments that forgot to ask whether they were seeing everything. But there's something in the name that I've come to respect over the years. The Vethrani are, as Counselor Pack said, an honest people. They didn't call it human deception or Concord failure. They called it a problem of measurement, a gap between what is visible and what is present, and they changed their science to account for it. That is, in my experience, the rarest and most difficult thing any civilization can do. The relay ship is still at the cradle boundary. The channel is still open. We have been in full diplomatic relationship with the Concord for 29 years now. And, in that time, the Vethrani theologians have revised the doctrine 4 more times, each revision pushing the concept of the resonant portrait towards something more honest and more humble. I have read all 4 revisions. They are remarkable documents. Each one begins with an acknowledgement of what the previous version failed to account for. The last time I spoke to Counselor Pack, she is retired now, as I am, living on a quiet world a long way from anywhere that matters. She told me the Concord had recently begun using a new phrase in its official communications, a phrase that did not appear in the doctrine before the 14th of November 2187. The phrase, translated from formal Vethrani register, is the visible portion, as in, this is what we have measured, as in, this is the visible portion, as in, there may be more. She said the phrase had propagated through Concord documentation remarkably quickly, as these things go in a theocratic bureaucracy. She said the younger choir members now used it almost automatically, almost without thinking about where it came from. I said, I'm glad something stuck, she said. More than you know. I think about the choir sometimes. Treat. In the quiet of the kind of mornings that come when you're old enough to have earned them. 31 ships in a formation no classification had ever needed to stop and think about before. Their resonant spines open, all that finely tuned instrument, pointed at us, certain they were seeing a complete thing. And then the wings of the solemn oath, opening in the blue-white light of the Thessivane cradle. Slow as ceremony, and the choir going still. Not afraid, not hostile, not calculating, just listening, just trying to hear for the first time what was actually there. I think that moment, the stillness, the silence, the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of an ancient civilization's certainty meeting something it had not been built to count for, is the truest picture I have of what first contact means. Not the arrival, not the weapons, not the measurement of rank and tier and significance. The moment when the instruments are still running and the data is coming in, and the answer is different from what the instruments expected, and the honest question surfaces. What have we been listening to? The choir fell silent. That is the thing I carry. Not because it was a victory. Not because we had shown them something that put us above them, proved something that needed proving, or won an argument that needed winning. The choir fell silent because they were honest enough to know that 4 minutes of silence in the face of genuine surprise is better than 37 minutes of confident noise in the face of a portrait you only thought was complete. We are a species that builds ships that fold. We fold them because it is practical. We unfold them when the time is right. The time in the Thessivane cradle on the 14th of November 2187, right. That is all I have to say about the matter, and it is, I believe, enough.